And thanks, to PairSoft for sort of hosting us and having us. But we're very excited to partner with PairSoft. And yeah, I think the focus here, I thought it was very, very clever what the PairSoft team came up with, but certainly very apropos to a lot of what's happening in the AP space. And so really what we're hoping to sort of cover here, at least in the first 30-40 minutes, is some perspective on fraud generally, but then really honing in on fraud in the accounts payable space, what you can do, how to think about it, sort of how PairSoft and Finexio can really help mitigate and prevent fraud, and what to do if it happens. Because unfortunately, if you go look at the stats, it's fairly common and ubiquitous, and it's more of a matter of how do you help to prevent, and then if unfortunately something does happen, how do you deal with it in a timely manner, so that ideally nobody's out any money. But very excited to be here. So rough agenda, we'll just give you a quick intro on myself, real quick on Finexio, and then we'll run through a few common fraud use cases within the AP space specifically, a few horror stories that you may have heard of or maybe have not have heard of, from companies big and small, companies that you think would be not susceptible to fraud and cybercrime, and then what to really do about it. Like, how do you help protect yourself from fraud and fraud risk? And then we'll even have a few examples of where Finexio has been able to really help mitigate and prevent fraud. And I really, it's not so much about us, it's about us really empowering you, empowering PairSoft to really limit fraud within your organization, and certainly around the accounts payable process. And then we'll leave a little bit of time for Q&A. And so if you have questions, stack them up, or I think you might be able to send them over to Farah now, but we'll certainly leave some time at the end to answer any questions you all may have. So, real quick about me, I've been in the B2B payment space for 15 plus years now. Finexio is actually my third B2B payments gig. It's been awesome. We've been able really to build a company from the ground up over the last 7-8 years, and we thought that was important, as where I come from, and Ernest, our CEO, we've worked together in multiple other companies, and really our whole sort of mindset was let's build a payments company focused on AP, but really again when we term that last mile, really facilitating the payment and doing that safely and securely and efficiently, and really be able to support multiple verticals, channel partners like PairSoft. So very excited to be here, and we can go ahead and dig in. So I think we wanted to start with a poll, and so just curious if any of you have ever experienced fraud. I think we got a few options here. And Farah, is this a?
Sorry, that is my oversight. I'm gonna blame pregnancy brain on that. The poll app is not working right now, but I can guess what the results would be. Apologies, everyone. I was supposed to put that in.
No worries. I'm gonna guess at least one of you, if not most of you, have experienced some type of fraud. I certainly know I have personally. If it's anything from folks I've tried to find like on Angie's List, or like a gardener who didn't show up or wanted me to pay early, and I was just stupid enough to do it. And then certainly at work, we'll look at a few stats. We'll talk about a few stats because it's very prevalent, really, throughout really the entire commerce ecosystem. Doesn't really matter if you're a person, a business, etc. The bad guys are out there and trying to get after you. But I do hope there's a few of you that have never experienced it, and hopefully there's fewer and fewer of you every year. And I think a lot of that comes with understanding, being cognizant of what can and does happen, so that you can be aware and help prevent it as best as possible. So real quick, we wanted just to start off with what do consumers expect, right? It's the holiday season, and there's more and more scams. I just got one recently. Basically somebody sending me a receipt for an iPad or something that supposedly I bought, or an Amazon receipt. I almost clicked on it. Clearly it was fraud. But I think a lot of the things you're going to see out there, look-alike shopping websites. It's becoming incredibly easy now to basically copy and paste a website that looks extremely close, and you don't even have to know how to write code anymore. Thanks to our friends at OpenAI and ChatGPT, the robots can effectively copy your website almost instantly. And you do not have to be a sophisticated engineer, who's able to write that code anymore. So be on the lookout there, of course. Social media ads, I think we've all sort of heard about this, but as it relates to hot gifts, particular deals you might get, spoof delivery notifications like text and emails. I get a lot of these. Fake job postings, malicious holiday apps. I think it sort of runs the gamut, obviously. Charities and fundraising campaigns. I'm a charitable guy, but I do know there's a few websites you can actually go to vet your charities. So if that is something you're passionate about, just do it safely. Grandparent scams and elderly fraud. I do feel bad for them. I try to tell my folks to not click on any links that they don't know, and don't answer the phone if they don't know who it is. We have caller ID now. Etsy, Craigslist, Facebook, so any of these marketplaces, right? I think, there's fairly prevalent instances of fraud there where you may not be buying something, you may be just losing some money. Gift card scams, puppy scams, phishing scams, certainly the card skimmers. I'm sure a few of you have seen like videos on that where, they basically like put a card reader on top of a card reader to try to steal your card info. And of course, the porch pirates. I'm sure a lot of us have seen those sort of door cam videos where guys are trying to steal your Amazon packages. So I guess long story short, there is no shortage of ways that the bad guys out there are trying to either steal your money, steal your presents, and really be a Grinch about it around the holidays. So do be on your on a lookout. Now, as it relates to AP payments, I think we sort of rounded it up into about a dozen different types of fraud that we see occurring quite a bit. Some of this is going to be very, very common, unfortunately fairly ubiquitous, like business email compromise. So half of organizations have experienced some type of business email compromise, and that's where, unfortunately, somehow a bad guy got access to an employee's email, and is able to effectively take it over or monitor what's coming through it, and then it can use that information or that access to perpetrate different types of fraud. Forged checks, stolen credit cards. This is unfortunately fairly common. We've got a few stats in the back that sort of talk about the different payment methods and which are more prone to fraud. I'm gonna let the cat out of the bag and say checks are still the #1 fraud vector as it relates to payment methods. We'll talk a little bit more about that and what you can do. Vendor imposters, we're seeing more and more of this, where people are claiming to be the vendor that you think they're emailing you, potentially calling you. This sort of dovetails into the last one, these deep fakes, where they can now actually mimic voices that you may think you recognize. It's Bob or Cindy on the other line, and you're positive it's them, but in some cases it's not. So this, I think we're going to continue to see rise, just again, given that the prevalence of all this, artificial intelligence that can go recreate things and create these deep fake type, fraud scenarios. We'll continue to be monitoring that, and I'm sure we'll all see more, unfortunately horror stories, but hopefully also some ways to help prevent it. Account act takeovers, not too dissimilar from some of the other, places we touched on. Invoice fraud, unfortunately does happens fairly frequently. So again, being on the lookout, making sure you triple matching on your invoices, make sure you got what you paid for, and there's not additional things that are stuck on there. Does happen quite a bit. Finexio deals with lots and lots of invoices, hundreds of thousands, if not millions, a year. Unfortunately, invoice fraud is a real thing, and it's hard for us to detect. So it's really incumbent upon a lot of organizations to make sure that PO matches the invoice, the stuff actually showed up at the loading dock or wherever it's supposed to get to. That is something that we do see through our customers. Company representative imposter. I think there's a lot of sort of imposter syndrome out there that people should be aware of. Outsourcers, again, sort of similar type story there. The U.S. Postal Service, as much as you like to think the USPS is safe, and yes, it's technically a federal crime if you tamper with the Postal Service. We'll see. We've got a couple of examples of where it's actually the postal people that were being the Scrooge and either stealing money or stealing whatever is being delivered. Organized crime, that's always a thing. Ransomware, mobile compromise, etc. Malicious insiders, bad guys. Hopefully you guys are screening your employees, making sure you don't have too many malicious insiders, but it does happen from time to time. So just be careful. And then of course, we touched on the deep fake. Like, again, I won't get into that. I'm sure there's plenty of videos you guys will all see over the coming years, where it just becomes more and more prevalent and slightly scary, but almost fascinating how quickly that technology has evolved really over the last year. So a few horror stories. We said we'd give you a few horror stories here. So we thought we'd just call out a few. And again, a lot of these, most of these, right, will typically involve business email compromise, or what we call vendor email compromise. And really, like, who are you dealing with? Either somebody took over your account or one of your employees' accounts, or took over the vendor's account. I can tell you, Finexio has seen this many times. We'll talk about fraud mitigation there, but I thought just a few we'd call out. You actually had a vice president of finance from Iona College who stole almost $1 million over 10 years, so a little bit at a time. Unfortunate, but things like this do happen. You have a sort of a bad insider, got a bad apple working there. The Las Vegas resident that got 144 months in jail for trying to defraud Medicaid. So Medicaid, Medicare fraud is extremely rampant. I've got a very deep sort of healthcare background, and I can tell you because there's so much money in the U.S. healthcare system. Of course, it's a high target for fraud. And you can see Toyota, 37 million business email compromise. Ubiquity, almost 47 million fraud, again, vendor email compromise. So it's happening. It almost doesn't matter sort of who you are, what vertical you're in, what kind of business you're in. If there's money that's moving around and the fraudsters know about it, they're gonna try to come after you. So just be careful. I think that's the name of the game. Be aware, and then be mindful. Paper check fraud. So like as we mentioned, sort of out of the gate, and as you can see here on the left, sometimes the postal workers get involved in stealing organized crime rings. So you can see 1.9 million, an example. Another postal worker, 1.7 million, stealing checks out of the mail. A lot of times it's very easy to know if it's a check. So this does happen. And while there are mitigation factors, you can try to reclaim those funds. It tends to be a big headache. But some of the times you can't do anything, right? If the people you're depending upon to deliver the mail are the ones actually stealing from you, it does become difficult. So this is why it's almost inevitable, to a degree, that an organization at some point is going to incur, some type of sort of fraud or fraud loss. So again, what we're here to do is, really talk about how do we help mitigate, manage, and do our best to deal with any type of fraud situation that may happen. 40 million fraud at Yale. I can tell you, Finexio does a lot with higher ed. This is a very big concern. So vendor management, vendor security, in terms of what we hear from our higher ed customers is really top of mind. I think what happened here at Yale really sort of reverberated through the higher ed system. And so this tends to be a very large talking point, for us with, most of our customer meetings. And here's the one that I think is probably the most surprising to me. But Facebook and Google got scammed out of almost $100 million over the course of a couple of years from one guy, Evaldas, who, again, just impersonating a legitimate company and sending in fake invoices. So yes, eventually they caught him. He got 30 years. But the way I think about it, Google, Facebook, there's a few companies that are really what you'd think, sort of bleeding edge, the very best technology, the very best security. In fact, most, of us probably have a Google account or a Facebook account that we rely on to be secure and safe, up to including dual factor authentication to, log into other websites. So the fact that, both these organizations were targets of fraud and the fraudsters were successful for quite some time and stole a lot of money, I think speaks volumes to it's not just the small companies, small mom and pop shops that are, potentially victims. It's even the large, most prestigious, literally the largest companies in the world that are also victims as well. So again, I think it's, and if you look at the three primary reasons why Google and Facebook were fooled: lack of verification for invoices from vendors, somebody had some insider information for how, invoices were managed, at the various companies. And then, looking at phishing practices. It still happens everywhere. So again, I think moral of the story here is it can happen to anybody, and it does. So just make sure you were, doing your very best to sort of look out for this, manage it, and then ultimately have a plan. It's important, because unfortunately it's probably going to happen, despite everybody's best efforts. And so it's really incumbent to make sure that you have a plan, you know what to do, if and when it does happen, so that ideally you can try to recoup those funds if you are in a loss type situation, or ideally prevent it as much as possible. And we'll touch on a little bit of this as we continue through the presentation. So, protecting your AP department from payment fraud risk. We will jump into a few things, and I'm pretty sure you all have sort of seen the overall sort of PairSoft pay sort of paradigm. So we're not going to touch on all of that, but if you sort of look on the right, there's really 5 pillars around what PairSoft pay is all about. So the fully managed payment delivery and operations, high touch supplier enablement, and then where we're focusing today is on payment data management and security. And so, what that really means, and how, how Finexio helps PairSoft, and ultimately PairSoft helps, you all, is through a few sort of different sort of key areas. So one is safe and secure payments. And so Finexio spent an inordinate amount of time creating and getting the right people, the right processes, and then the right systems in place to manage and prevent fraud to, to the very best of our ability. And so a lot of that, we do leverage technology, things like account validation services. This is actually a service provided by JP Morgan, and early warning. And this is really around bank account validation. So making sure we can validate the bank account, that the name on the bank account matches the person who's, trying to receive an ACH payment, as an example. And if not, there are processes and procedures, so that we certainly follow to deal with anybody that we aren't able to verify a bank account. KYC, KYB. So again, making sure you know who your customer is. Again, we have sort of a full due diligence process that we will typically run our customers through, and certainly to a degree suppliers. And again, leveraging different types of technology. OFAC sanctions and screening, if you're not familiar, the Fed, the Federal Reserve, and actually even guys like Interpol, really don't want you paying bad guys, paying terrorists, money launderers, criminals. And so there's a series of lists that you can actually bump up a company or even an individual to ensure like they're not on a particular list that would preclude you from paying them. Banks are very sensitive to this. They get fined heavily if they create an account or actually pay, for lack of a better word, a bad guy. So this is something that we do. We literally monitor every single payment that goes out the door and screen it for what we call OFAC out of the gate. And that's the Office of Foreign Asset Control. That's a government entity that really monitors and regulates all of this. And that goes along with AML compliance. So that's anti-money laundering. So there are rules and regs that certainly Finexio and any bank and really payment company that we just have to follow. And again, it's to prevent money laundering. So we're not funding terrorists, et cetera. And then above that, what we also do, not only are we tracking, and looking at every single payment that's going out the door for, make sure they're not on one of these lists, but we're also looking at other things. So we call this transaction monitoring. So as just as a high level example, if you're paying a particular vendor $1,000 a month for whatever sort of recurring service, and then all of a sudden we see a spike, it went to 100,000 in a given month, that's going to set off a flag in our system to say, hey, this is anomalous. Is this something we need to look into? Do we need to check with the with the buyer, the customer, to make sure that this is in fact legitimate? So we'll look at things, and we think of that as sort of like velocity. Is this payment within the norm of what we would expect? And if it's not, then that triggers our system. You guys would say, yep, that's totally normal. We had a big thing, and the money will go. But again, there's a lot of machine learning that now sits on top of this to go look for sort of aberrant patterns and of behavior as it relates to money movement. And that's what part of the service you get with Finexio and PairSoft Pay. And I think it should go without saying, but again, thinking about how you all are storing your data, really the payment data storage and security. So making sure that, of course, the data you have is securely collected, validated, encrypted, and stored. So Finexio is actually SOC type 2, 1 and 2 certified. All of our sensitive data is encrypted. We of course use AWS like a lot of folks do. And then really the roles and security around how and who has access to data. The whole notion of sort of the least access possible is really what how Finexio governs, and that's really what SOC is really meant to do. It's like give access to the people that really need it, but then make sure that there's a lot of tight controls and it's auditable in terms of who has access and who's done what with any sensitive data. So if that's not something your organization is doing, we highly recommend it, because once the data gets out there, it's very hard to reel it back in. And then the last thing too, data cleaning and enrichment. So oftentimes, and we know this, we see this all the time with our customers, is you don't have great information on your suppliers or your vendors. You may have an email, you may have an address, you may have a phone number, but you may not have all of those. And so one of the things Finexio does, we'll actually go do third-party validation. That can be things like actually pinging the IRS to make sure like, yep, that tax ID is associated with that business, or things like Zoom info, to go look for third-party, or in LexisNexis as an example, to verify business identity, address, etc. So these are all things that you get just working with us. But again, if you're not doing this on your own, it's becoming incumbent upon all of you to just to really make sure you've got the right data, where you need it and when you need it. So how we think about fraud. So and think about ERP integration and how we can help combat payment fraud. One is first detecting it. So depending on the type of fraud, it can be detected by the customer, the supplier, or Finexio. So again, Finexio's got your back. We're constantly looking, but it doesn't mean we're going to see everything, right? If there's a bad actor in on the inside, that's going to be more difficult for us to see. So again, important that you all have policies, procedures in place to help manage it from the inside. And then reporting fraud. And the biggest thing is if you were to notice something, as soon as possible, like do not wait, because there's a process that happens, especially if money's out the door and we need to start to work with the banks. It's incredibly important that you report it right away. You should make sure you have a process internally to do that. Then obviously to work with PairSoft, work with Finexio to deal with that fraudulent transaction, because then what's going to happen is next is there's an investigation that happens, and depending on the type of payment, how much it's for, was it a check, was it an ACH, is really going to determine the type of investigation that we're able to do. And so again, the sooner you tell us and the more information we're able to have up front, the better and the higher likelihood of recovering those funds is going to be. And then ultimately you look to help prevent that in the future, which is really blocking future transactions. And so if we do notice something, we will do our very best to stop it. And a perfect example would be virtual cards. So one of the ways we're able to pay providers, suppliers, vendors, providers on your behalf is with a virtual card. And what we've done is actually turn off certain types of merchant codes so that they, if somebody receives a virtual card, they can't go take it to Amazon and go shopping. Right, we really prevent a lot of those retail transactions, because typically, like a lot of the bad guys that will steal a card, that's what they're going to go do. They're going to go buy some Christmas presents on Amazon, as an example, or Shein is another one we saw. So one of the things we're going to do is we've got a lot of controls in place, as that's an example. But if we see anything in the future, we're going to say, no, we cannot pay that address, we cannot pay that supplier. So again, blocking those types of things. And that's something, we're going to do proactively, of course, retrospectively, but again, in collaboration with you always makes it better and stronger. So again, we're going to run, fairly quickly through, what, these processes look like for check, ACH, and card. Make sure you guys understand sort of the timing, the life cycle. And then again, of course, we'll have time for questions at the end. But as it relates to check fraud, and again, this is the most prevalent type of fraud that's still out there, unfortunately. Again, incumbent upon everybody to report it just as soon as you can, really within 2 business days. There's typically banks are going to have like a window when it's possible to recoup the funds, but at some point the funds are going to be gone. They're likely going overseas. Again, not making this up, but the bad guys are very sophisticated, and so there's a fairly tight window in which we have to try to recoup those funds. Sort of before they're gone. One of the things we don't like about checks, but it's just part of the process, is there is an affidavit that you're going to have to fill out with, really the sponsor bank. So certainly Finexio and PairSoft Pay can assist, but this is basically attesting to what has happened, and then that's given to the banks and the authorities to go investigate this and do their very best to then reverse and refund. Try to get those funds back. So again, it's not a foolproof system, but again, timing really is of the essence. If I can stress anything on, on this slide, it's really the sooner you find it, let us know, the better are the odds that we're going to be able to help get that back. Because we'll then go work with the sponsor banks and the receiving banks to try and recover those funds or put a stop on those funds. But again, time is of the essence. And then I think too, just keep in mind, while we never want this to happen, it can take a while. Banks are not that fast, and there's a lot of documentation that they have to do. And so in the process to, sort of be fully wrapped up can take up to 120 days. I won't say it's typically that long, when we do, encounter some of these situations, but, just to set expectations sort of on the sort of high end of the sort of time scale, just be prepared. And then of course there's always progress. So, Finexio works with the sponsor banks. We make sure that you guys are apprised in terms of, where things are at any given time. Ideally it never happens, but just to be clear, it's the sooner you catch it, the better. And if it does happen, it could take, several months. And that's really not us. That's really the banks having to do an investigation that they ultimately are then reporting, to folks like the SEC and the Fed. Because if they get caught with their pants down too many times, basically not catching fraud, the bank's getting a lot of trouble. So they have a lot of policies and procedures that they have to follow. So just understand, it's not this isn't a PairSoft Finexio thing sort of dragging our feet. It's just part of the process, and to be clear, it's not an ideal process. So, but it's the process we live with thanks to the federal government. ACH fraud. So again, very similar to what we started with checks. Report it just as quickly as you possibly can. What's going to happen is we'll try to freeze those funds. And again, there are capabilities for, so the bank that we work with, all the funds that, PairSoft Pay flows through is actually JP Morgan. So very secure, very reliable bank. And so we work directly with them. If we do see, an instance of fraud or we have a concern, we'll do our very best to, again, freeze those funds. Again, there's an indemnification agreement, very similar to the affidavit. You're basically just attesting to, yes, this happened. It was, it was a mistake or it was fraud. We'll get that email agreement, out to you. This helps us then go, do the full investigation while having it documented clearly. And again, in this case, JP Morgan will do their very best to recall the funds. And again, I'll just keep stressing, the timeline. The sooner the better. And again, this also can take up to 120 days. And then of course, we'll provide updates as we have them. The good news is, JP Morgan's very, buttoned up. They have a good, they have a good process, they have good updates, but it can take a while. So again, timing is of the essence if you see anything. And then card. So card's a little bit more unique in a good way as it relates to fraud. And I think a lot of you know this, especially if you've ever had like your own merchant account. There's a lot of guarantees that are put around cards, and that's one of the benefits of working with the card networks. It's one of the reasons credit cards have those fees, besides your sort of points and cash back. But basically, you're going to submit a dispute, not too dissimilar to what you need to do with checks and ACH, and then we'll work with the card issuers. So Finexio actually worked with multiple card issuers, which again, you guys don't really have to worry about. And then the good news is you do have a little bit longer here. You have up to 60 days from when the transaction was posted. And again, this is one of the benefits of working with the card networks. It's one of the reasons cards are more expensive. And then we'll deal with most of the issues. Once we have, as many details as we have from you, we'll work with the card networks and our issuers to do our best to bring that case to resolution. But again, it can take up to 120 days. And again, that's on the outside. Typically it's less. Especially if we catch it early, and then we have an ability at that point to give you guys updates, recoup the funds, and then ideally block any potential sort of future scenario there. So good news is when we'll touch on this, fraud happens significantly less often with cards, virtual cards specifically, and there's a lot more mitigation factors that are at play in there. The other nice part too is you could imagine there's what Finexio and JP Morgan are doing, the card issuers as well, in addition to the card networks. And so by that I mean like MasterCard, Discover, they're actually looking to prevent fraud. So there's just a lot more eyeballs as it relates to sort of monitoring and looking for fraud when it comes to cards, which is one of the reasons that we like card. Let's just talk, there's a couple, just examples of, what we've been able to do. So we can talk about that real quick. Sorry. And so how we, deal with this, again, enhance security. And again, this all sort of hones back to the idea of let's have a card first mentality. So for all of you that are, customers and leveraging PairSoft Pay, of course, there's the whole notion of, sort of cash back, the incentives, very similar to what you all receive probably as consumers. If you have a credit card, you probably are getting points or cash back. Very similar idea, working with Finexio and PairSoft Pay. But there's the enhanced security that we mentioned. So, our ability to stop unauthorized transactions, guarantee that, those transactions can be backed out and refunded within a given time frame. The real-time monitoring. So not only are we doing real-time monitoring, but the card networks are, the card issuers that we work with are. So in this case, this would be, like JP Morgan as an example. Their card network and, their issuing side of the house is also looking and trying to detect fraud. Then there's the dispute resolution and chargeback protection, that we mentioned. So again, your transactions are just safer if they're on a card, which is again one of the reasons we push this card first mentality. Really trying to move businesses away from, hey, I can issue a check, to I want to issue a card, and then if I have to, I'll issue a check. But we want to focus as much on delivering as many cards as possible. Simply alone for the security by itself is well warranted. And finally, enhanced record keeping and tracking. Virtual cards eliminate the potential for a lot of human error. Again, so because there's not a piece of paper that's typically involved. And again, for that card to be processed, it has to be processed. Just like if you signed up for Square, PayPal, you've got your own little dongle at the farmer's market. Anybody that's able to accept card payments also has to be vetted. They're not just going to let you accept payments with a card willy-nilly. They're going to have their own due diligence process. So again, just a lot more eyeballs on the process that I think is important to appreciate. And then virtual cards also reduce the risk of human error. Again, it's electronic and everything's tracked too. I think where with an ACH, you sort of send it and forget it. You hope it gets there, but really no news is good news, which is how you can sort of close your books and say that it's paid. With checks, you'll typically see if a check is cleared. You can get that cleared check image, but that's about all you're going to get. With cards, you get vastly more data, and that's not necessarily something you need to concern yourself with, but just know Finexio and PairSoft, there's a lot more detail that comes back with that. So we know exactly which merchant processed that at which terminal, so where did they process that card payment, who's associated with that terminal, who actually issued the terminal to the merchant. So again, just a lot more sort of rich data. If anything were to happen, we're able to sort of hone in on that significantly faster. I think this is probably just about the last slide. So thanks for bearing with me. But again, on the right-hand side, look, checks continue just to be the most vulnerable payment method. And this is a report. It's free to anybody. AFP puts it out every year in conjunction with JP Morgan. I put a link down there. I think we're sharing this deck afterwards, or if not, we'll make sure you at a minimum are able to access this link. But AFP puts out a payments fraud and control report every year, and these numbers are pretty typical for what you see year over year. So, checks, 60+% of all organizations experience check fraud. Corporate and commercial credit cards, again, that typically tends to be a lot more sort of internal, bad actors there. But then from there, you still see 30%, in terms of ACH type payments. So be it wire or an ACH, still significantly high. And then what I like to point out, and there certainly was an uptick from 21 to 22, is virtual cards are single digit fraud. So literally, orders, not quite an order of magnitude lower fraud. And that's just because they're single use. So you can't just run it and keep going and buying a bunch of stuff. They're for a fixed amount. And there's a lot more controls. If you need to place additional controls on who can actually process that card, you actually have that capability. But really, you have all the benefits of the card networks that we discussed. And then they're single use. They operate very much like a gift card. If you put $100 on it, once that $100 is gone, there's that's going to limit your loss versus more of the traditional commercial or corporate credit cards where you can just probably keep swiping up to a limit, or some cases, a lot of those cards have no limit. Virtual cards are a lot safer because they're confined and they're finite. And so I think, with that, just keep in mind, checks are not your friend. The more you can do to push your organization, and certainly if you're working with PairSoft Pay and Finexio, we're going to help you to promote, virtual cards, not only internally, but really to your vendors and suppliers. And then of course we can offer them, other payment methods as well. But not only, is there sort of that cashback notion, but again, the security that comes with it, which I think is, growing in importance really every year. And especially as we see the sort of evolution of this technology, that makes it easier and easier for less sophisticated bad guys, if you will, to perpetrate fairly sophisticated fraud attempts. So I think that's where we end. Yep, we can stop there and open it up to QA. Farah, if you want to help facilitate.
Yeah, thank you so much, Chris. That was great. We did have a few questions during and ahead of time, but as we're asking these, everybody feel free to ask more because I know that was a lot of great information. The first one was, what would you say is the top way an automated system prevents internal employees from committing fraud?
Yeah, so typically what we're going to see is a set of checks and balances. So, most of the software, that we work with or integrate with will have some type of approval process. Right. So that means, it doesn't just go from, yep, let's get this paid to off it goes. It may go to, CFO or somebody in the accounts payable team who's responsible for, sort of second set of eyes, on a particular type of payment. And then controls, really like roles and responsibilities, so hopefully most of you all have sort of ended the days where you guys have a common login for a very important system. Everybody has a unique login, so it's auditable, it's traceable, so you can really look to see who's out there. And then of course, internal training, and I know it sounds boring. Probably a lot of us sit through those, sort of mandatory annual, compliance, security training videos, and take some of those tests, but it's important to stay abreast of what potentially could happen so that you're aware, because some people, the person you may least expect may be the one that, perpetrates some fraud. So again, I think it starts with awareness and then making sure your organization really has proper controls in place to help, really mitigate and prevent any potential bad actor inside.
Great. One that we just received was, what other industries besides higher education see outsized proportions of fraud?
Good question. So certainly e-com. So e-commerce is pretty common. Anything sort of related to gambling. There's a lot of fraud that you'll see around there. Anything that tends to be a bit more retail oriented, you'll see it's a lot harder to perpetrate fraud on millions and millions of dollars. That's going to get noticed extremely quickly. Whereas if you think industries that typically are going to have like sort of smaller transaction sizes, tends to be where the fraudsters like to play. It's like, play it again, Sam. Let's do it one more time. Get another $100. A lot like what we saw with that Google and Facebook, example. Those were not huge invoices that they were submitting. They just submitted a lot of them over the course of several years, which then ultimately added up to a very significant amount of money. So, I think some of it is less sort of vertical centric, but a lot of it's surrounded around transaction size. Because right, you're just going to pay less attention to that $100 recurring payment maybe you put on a card, versus the $1 million payment you're making to your most important software vendor, or whoever our supplier, as an example. I'm trying to think there's any others. Higher ed, construction's another one you see. Again, I think any sort of businesses that tend to be sort of slow and outdated. Healthcare, again, another one. I think with healthcare, it's really just a function of it's a multi-trillion-dollar industry, along with construction, right? So any of these industries that just have so much money flowing through them, there's the fraud is almost inevitable, and the bad guys know that, and so they go and target those types of industries. So hopefully that was helpful.
Some would argue that the US healthcare system in itself is fraudulent, but that's another webinar.
Well, there is that. You want to get me on that topic? We'll set up another session. Actually, an interesting personal story, but we'll save it for another time.
We received another one. Companies requesting current vendors to switch to accepting virtual cards for payment. Is there an average percent that are willing to accept versus saying, no, I won't accept?
Yeah, and I think this is important because it's not everybody that's going to say yes. And again, what's unique is what we see are typically a couple of things. One, there's going to be a few verticals that are just like they're okay with it. They see it as like just how they do business, right? Amazon, could you imagine paying Amazon with anything but a card these days? I don't even know if they allow you to do that. Like a lot of airlines now, they'll only take a card from you. You can't pay cash for that drink you want to get on, on your cross country flight. But typically what you're going to see is anywhere from on the very low end, and again, very low end, I'm going to say like 10% are going to accept card. And this is your entire vendor base up to 20, 30, maybe even 40%. And so Finexio is actually got a pretty differentiated way we go about this. Again, we employ machine learning to really score each individual vendor on their likelihood to accept, or we work directly with MasterCard and Discover, and they can tell us, yeah, this guy or this company accepts card or they don't, and under certain circumstances. But really, what our job is to get as many of those suppliers on card, but it's certainly not the majority, right? I think the highest we've ever seen is about 40-ish%, and that's a great number. And then you look for other alternative payment methods, such as ACH, et cetera, so they can limit the checks as much as possible, while really maximizing that card adoption, to the best of our sort of collective ability.
Great. And then another one is some of our vendors are still really committed to paper checks. Is there any extra protection we receive for opting into automated payments, even if we still have to pay them by check?
Yeah, so there are a few things that certainly Finexio will do on your behalf. So again, sort of the OFAC and transaction monitoring, again, that happens for every payment that we help facilitate, sort of goes out the door. In addition, and again, it's probably something, it's a little more nuanced that's probably hard to appreciate, but we also work, again, the money flows through JP Morgan ultimately. It's not even a Finexio account. And so we work closely with them. And so they have some fraud controls that they're going to be, looking at before payments go out the door. Things like address verification. We don't tout this a lot, but every address gets screened before it goes out the door. So we'll clean up to make sure things are going ideally to the right place. You do get traditional things like positive pay. So don't worry if somebody steals your bank account and routing number, they can't just start writing checks on it because they happen to steal a check in the mail from that we issued. And then from there it's just more like proactive monitoring. And I think like sort of tangential to that question is then you've also got the power of like our team. So we have a supplier enablement team, and they're very good at sort of having these discussions with suppliers and vendors that are like, I can only take a check. Are you sure you can only take a check? So there's different methodologies that we can use to engage those suppliers who think they have to take a check and talk about our alternatives and the benefits of the alternatives. And again, it's not, because this isn't like a one size fits all, and it's not, hey, this guy wins and the other side loses. We really try to make it sort of mutually beneficial. And so a lot of what you get with us is our team will facilitate and handle those discussions, on your behalf, but certainly with any guidance you care to give, so that we can start to migrate those folks off of checks. And then last but not least, there are techniques that you can choose to adopt in terms of payment timing. So perhaps you send your checks in 60 days and 90 days, but you're willing to offer earlier payments for virtual cards, or potentially an ACH. So there are other sort of carrots you can put out there to your vendor base that may make it more compelling for them to say yes to an electronic payment.